This is Writing Lessons, and I'm your host, Silas House. In each episode of Writing Lessons, we look at a different topic of creative writing, and today we're focusing on poetry. Our guest for this episode is one of our finest poets, Frank X. Walker. He is a legend in Kentucky literature, and his work has been embraced internationally. He is the winner of an NAACP Image Award and a Lannan Fellowship, among many other honors. He was the Kentucky Poet Laureate for 2013 and 14, and he's also known as a poet and teacher who encourages and guides his students and other writers. Thanks so much for joining us today, Frank.
It's good to be here, Silas. Thanks for inviting me.
When you have an idea for a poem, what happens next?
I always hope that I'm not driving, I'm not otherwise engaged, and can't respond immediately before I lose that idea or thought. And if I'm lucky to be uncommitted, I try to get right to a space where I can sequester myself alone and write out those initial thoughts longhand. I still struggle to interface with this new technology. I'm not one of those poets who is writing on an iPhone yet and then reading from them at the podium. I'm still in love with paper and that old school process of longhand, cursive writing, trying to figure it out. Yeah, it's the pace, I think. It's like I write at the same speed that I think. So I need a platform or a technology that moves at my speed. And it's old fashioned, old school pencil and paper.
Mm-hmm. We're similar in that as writers, we've both had to work our whole lives. So, how do you balance writing?
I never set a goal of finding balance. I don't know if I ever thought that was possible uh, in my life because of my commitment to family and always having a young family, growing family, and work obligations. I just committed to, if I could honor the feeling that I needed to do it, I would just find the time to do it. And I knew it wasn't going to be balanced. So what it actually meant was that I would get less sleep very early in my life. Once I committed to writing, I wasn't up all night, partying and chasing social opportunities. I was sleeping so I could get up early to write. And for me, my writing, my kind of most fruitful writing time of the day has always been between like 4:30 in the morning and 8:30. So I've tried to do everything I could to be awake at that time, including being rested enough to like create in that space, and honor that over the years. And there's not much competition for those hours in the course of a day, even with a family. Uh, Even when we had kids in diapers in the house, I could still write because at least they would be sleeping by that point, uh, even if they were still nursing. But I've been blessed to have a partner who's been more than willing to carry the weight of that time of the day because she knows that's the one time of the day I need for me and for my writing.
Being an artist often requires sacrifice, and I certainly sacrificed sleep was the main thing that I always say because that's the thing is you're always looking for more time. You know,
Right.
that's I've never run out of ideas. In fact, I have too many ideas and then not enough time to orchestrate them. It sounds similar for you. What's more important in a poem for you? The image or the music, or is that all of one piece? Talk to me about that.
I don't know that I worry about the parts of them when I'm crafting. I think that my earliest concern when I'm trying to build or make or bring a poem down or over or through is that I get the emotional temperature right. I'm really trying to capture how I feel in that moment or how the speaker, if it's not me, is feeling in that moment and trying to find the absolute most accurate words to capture that feeling. Because I think that's the heart of the poem for me. Then after that, my next concern is a solid landing or exit. I feel like it's important to me that the poem end well. However it starts, I think they can start in a million places, but uh, I think when you get to the last line that not only you should know, but the audience or the reader should know, oh, that's the end. That there's something about how the poems move down the page in the ebbs and flows and conflict and resolution or whatever the thing was, even if it goes full circle, that and everybody knows that this is the end. And
Hmm.
there's something about that that I try to honor. Those two things, getting the emotional temperature right and the exit. If I can get that right, I'm generally pretty satisfied, even if it's a form or a new experimental form or just a blank verse or free verse. If those two things are working, uh, I'm usually okay with it at that point.
I find so much music in your poetry, though. When I'm reading your poetry, I feel like I can tap my foot to it. I don't know how you do that. And we know there's a thin veil between the writer and the reader, right? So you
Oh,
must be tapping your foot to some degree while you're writing it.
well, probably so, because I think at this point I don't trust what I know about music, but I do know that my earliest influences as a writer were musicians. I mean, Marvin Gaye and Curtis Mayfield, and those really old school artists that my mother listened to, and I got to listen to early in my developmental years, taught me a lot about everything that I think is essential to poetry, to good poetry, particularly the emotional stuff, the how to manage political stuff, how to deal with even sexual and uncomfortable subjects. How you can poet your way around those, any discussion, any subject. Uh, and I was, really, I'm still a fan of those same musicians. If I had to choose a handful of writers to spend time with, I'd ask me if I could swap out some musicians because those musicians taught me as much about writing as any book or writer ever did. Because I think they were also, men of color. I felt a kind of proximity to them and their voice, and at the same time, I used their lessons in a broader way as I moved towards manhood and my own development. My mother was a single parent. So there was no man in the house. So I had to find this other co-parent in other places and that art space in the music on the vinyl, coming out the speakers. I got my first ideas of what a man was supposed to be, based on what my mother listened to and what she thought a man was supposed to be. Because I
Mhm.
figured that should be my goal, whatever my mother wanted. Man, I laugh because, in the age that my peers were listening to and viewing Black exploitation and falling in love with individuals like Shaft, who were these slick, urban city guys, I was listening to Bill Withers and
Mhm.
him singing about Grandma's Hand. And it was that kind of masculinity that was really what some people would consider not very masculine at all. But it made sense in my neighborhood, in my house. And it gave me kind of a barometer to measure myself up against. And I think that really allowed me to be the sensitive and empathetic, artist, connoisseur, of art, even because I think it made me a great enjoyer of other people's art as well.
Mhm.
Understanding that there was a really different way to be a man than mass media was teaching us, and it had nothing to do with violence and misogyny.
Mhm.
That there was another way to get there, and I laugh now when I think about those how I got there through those musicians. I mean, it's really quite a lesson.
So it sounds like you're saying that a huge part of being a writer for you is being an observer. It's listening, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
listener.
I think sometimes people think they have to be like putting words on the page all the time to be writers. But really, the biggest part of it is being still, right? And listening, watching.
I think when people get caught up in thinking about, say, a thing like writer's block, like I don't think writer's block really exists because my definition of what writing is. And I think that writing includes the research for writing, which means
Yeah.
the listening for writing and the research and the long drives, just looking at mountains and sky and
Mhm.
trees. That's writing to me because you're, listening to sitting with old people and babies, listening to people laugh, going to concerts and being lost in those crowds. That everything that is about being alive, I think, is fuel that you might use on the page one day. So even though you're not putting pen to page in that moment, I think if you're awake And even if you're asleep and dreaming, you could write about what you dreamt. So I think that if you're alive, you're engaged in a writing process if you're a writer. And if you don't acknowledge being a writer, that you're a creative person, you just may not be using it, but you're engaged in a process because you're experiencing your things or things that happen in your world that you might use later in an art project,
Hmm.
And like when I was 14 years old, this thing happened. It was horrible. And I made a movie about it when I was 30. Well, that meant that at 14, you were involved in the artist process because you were experiencing the thing that now you're making art about. So I try to, back away from those anything restrictive that says this is a very limited way of how you get to poetry, who a poet is, all those things that don't leave you room to just, be yourself and enjoy being alive.
Well, your most recent book, Load in Nine Times, I think is absolutely one of your best books. And it
Thank you.
makes me think about you're giving voice to these Black Civil War soldiers. And so I'm guessing while you were writing these poems, you were sort of walking through the world thinking about things through their point of view, right? You were putting yourself in their shoes to write these poems so vividly. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's part of my process. I think it's a lot like what method actors do to really get into character. I've I try to get as close to the character as I can, and sometimes that means going to the physical space. I spent a lot of time at Camp Nelson, and I still am. I think the research for this book is technically not over, even though the book is done. I'm still immersed in and out of that space,
Hmm.
trying to understand these characters and voices because I really believe the landscape, contributes to voice. I think um, when I'm writing from people's points of view that are beyond this current time. The Civil War narrative is 160 years old. So to go backwards in time for me requires a little bit of travel, mentally and emotionally. And I need little tricks. I need to look at images to transport me back. I need to look at those uniforms. I need to visit museums. I need to read books about that time period. There are a few movies that help take me back there, like the movie Glory.
Hmm.
But once I'm there, uh, I can find the voices, and once I hear the voice, then I can write from that. But it doesn't happen easily and immediately when I sit down to write. If I'm writing in a time period that is not the one I'm living in.
What's the best thing you've ever learned about poetry? The best lesson you ever had?
The best lesson I've learned is to not run from the when it becomes uncomfortable. Nikki Finney once said that writing and then sharing your first drafts should feel like standing on a table naked
Hmm.
and fully exposed, and people can see all your warts, and that you can't hide anything. And you open yourself up to criticism. But if you survive it, it's a kind of courage and thick skin that you can build from that process that will make it easier for you to do that every time. At some point, you might become an exhibitionist and leap up on the table and say, "Look at me." I think that's when it's time to get out. But I think what she meant was taking that risk. And a lot of people think that poetry should just be something beautiful and meditative. And that was never enough for me. I think that given all the ways that poetry can move people and heal people, even, that it made sense to me to use it in as many ways as possible. So I love writing historical poetry, and I love bringing the narratives and stories of people who have passed on back to life in a way that allows people to experience them in a way that feels cinematic and real to them. And and I think that we really got a raw deal in Kentucky when we were taught about the Civil War. It was in a very kind of romanticized, you know, uh, abbreviated space that is the exact opposite of what we should have known about the Civil War, and especially for African Americans in Kentucky.
Hmm.
Uh, and there's so many stories that have been undertold or have not been told or been told incorrectly that it would take 1,000 books and 3 lifetimes to try to get it all at least started.
Is there a particular poet or book that you would direct people to who are just starting to try to learn more about poetry that you think could help them?
It depends what they wanted to know about poetry. I think that I keep coming back to almost anything that Lucille Clifton has written. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because she's writing and she's living it a real life. She's raising a house full of children and trying to be a poet at the same time. I, I think that's instructive. How to use the time you have. So most of her work is short. She didn't have like hours and hours to meditate over a poem. She might have, you know, 25 minutes because the kids are napping. And so she's trying to maximize that time. So I love the lesson in that, and I love how she, uh, you know, writes about real things in a way that uh, you don't feel like you need a college degree to read her work. I think that's important. I always wanted to believe that my readers would include my siblings, even though they would laugh at me to think that uh, I gave them a book as a gift, because nothing against them. I love them to death, but they never valued reading in the way that I did growing up. I was the weird kid out. I was the
Right.
odd one. But I think about them as the audience members anyway. I imagine them always out there in those seats listening, and I want to be able to speak directly to them. So I think it's important that if you have degrees, that they don't get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so those are two really valuable lessons. But Lucille Clifton's how her life impacted her work, and I think that if you respect your life enough, that you don't stop it or end it or try to live a different one in order to be a writer, that you take whatever space remains and you let that part of your life also influence this part of your life so that you can move easier from space to space. It doesn't take a out of body experience to go write something.
Mm-hmm.
It just takes time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about your poetry is that it's so accessible without sacrificing artistry. I was one of those people that often felt excluded by poetry. I felt like there was something I wasn't getting, that I wasn't smart enough to get. And so, when you find poets that feel accessible to you, it feels like you've been welcomed into the world of poetry. So I've always appreciated that about your work.
That's by design because I think I came to poetry in the same way that I didn't like poetry for a long time because of the way poetry was served to me, and I didn't think it was mine, that it belonged to somebody with more education and
Right.
some other culture and some other belief system, that I was too small and uninteresting for anything that poetry had to say. Uh, and now I know that's the furthest thing from the truth. And so
Hmm.
that accessibility is the biggest compliment. And I really want, I think the people who need poetry are those people who think that it's not for them.
Well, do you have a brief prompt that you can give to people that, that would get them writing?
Yeah, I have some favorite quick starters. I usually choose between what I call a sound study or a color study. And I'll do a sound study, and the instructions are pretty simple. It assumes that if you had a full day already, and I asked the writer to rewind back to when you woke up this morning and think about every sound you heard between waking up in the bed or wherever you woke up at up till now, to this moment in this classroom, and then rewrite in chronological order uh, your day over again, but just focus on the sounds you heard. Let us hear, if you heard a siren outside, if the alarm woke you up, the running water when you washed your face, the electric toothbrush, somebody knocking on the door or somebody screaming that it's time to get up, whatever you heard that got you out of bed. And then those sounds that really stuck with you over the course of the day in the same order. And it's fun to watch people rewind in their head and move through those sounds. But it's always surprising to people that they were listening all day. They just weren't paying attention to what they were listening to. But when they rewind and just focus on the soundtrack, that it's there, it's right there, and you know what you heard, you just received it passively. And I'm asking them to go back and get it and write them down in the order that it happens. And it always makes a great list poem. And and it doesn't require a lot of experience with poetry. It just requires being able to reach back and grab it
Mhm.
and find a word to describe what you heard.
Yeah, I think doing prompts, little writing exercises is so beneficial. I especially think like a timed exercise somehow frees me up to write without,
Mhm.
you don't have time to freak out about it. You just write and you let it come out. I've seen so much great stuff come out of a 10-minute writing prompt. What do you think why is that?
I think we already have the information, and what those time writing prompts do is it's a real quick key into that information and lets it out in a controlled space. In the same way that, I tell my students that they are the master of everything they've experienced, that all their accumulated knowledge and experience belongs to them. And nobody can tell the stories that they can tell because nobody's experienced what they've experienced it in their way, and they should value that. And so we do a lot of memory exercises. I really believe that without memory, you can't really write good poetry, that you need memory, research, imagination, and some empathy. But that memory is first. It's like what I remember about this thing or this person or this place or this time. That if you can start there, and if you do it often enough, you can train yourself to really, let memory serve you well as a writer. And I think that's the trick, is harnessing that memory, before you lose it. At my age, that's the thing I'm worried about more than anything these days is, as I become more and more forgetful, it's like, what are the memory tricks I can use to train my memory to be stronger and more rigid, to hold on to these things as long as I can.
Writing Lessons is an initiative of the 2024-2025 Kentucky Poet Laureate. That's me, Silas House. I'm thankful for the support of the Kentucky Arts Council, the Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning, the Office of Governor Andy Beshear, and Kentucky Humanities. This show is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me. I hope you will share the show with other writers, students, or anyone who is interested in the creative process. Please subscribe to our show, and if you like it, I hope you'll leave a review or a 5-star rating. That'll help us get the show to more listeners. Thanks so much for listening to Writing Lessons.